It begins with an unexpected silence, a silence so heavy, so deliberate, that it rippled through global politics like a shockwave. For the first time in G20 history, South Africa simply didn't show up. No delegation walking across red carpets, no officials boarding flights, no polite speeches crafted in diplomatic language. Instead, the message was short, sharp, and stunning. South Africa will not travel to the United States for the G20 handover. And within hours, cameras captured something even more surprising. South African officials standing side by side with Burkina Faso's Ibrahim Traoré, signaling a new alignment on the continent. That image alone sent Washington into panic mode, because suddenly, Africa's most industrialized nation and Africa's most defiant revolutionary leader were standing together. And then came the moment that turned political tension into a global headline. Donald Trump publicly criticized South Africa, calling the nation unqualified, calling its leaders unprofessional, and claiming the country had become a danger to global order. But what happened next shocked the world even more. South Africa did not panic. There was no emotional press conference, no defensive statements, no desperate attempt to win approval. They responded calmly, confidently, and with a line that echoed across African social media. Respect is not requested, it is required. In that moment, something historic was unfolding, a shift in posture, a shift in tone, a shift in Africa's global identity. And behind this shift was a growing alliance few in the West saw coming, a partnership between South Africa and Burkina Faso that is now reshaping how African nations see themselves, how they see their future, and how they intend to deal with global powers who have long believed Africa would remain obedient, divided, and dependent. Across Johannesburg, Pretoria, Cape Town, Ouagadougou, Bobo Diolaso's social media erupted. Tens of millions of Africans, from students to intellectuals to factory workers, were calling this the beginning of a new African era, a moment of dignity, a moment of sovereignty, a moment when Africa stopped asking permission. And for Washington, London, and Brussels, this was the one thing they feared most: Africa discovering its voice. But this story is much deeper than a diplomatic refusal. It is about history. It is about power. It is about why the United States maintains more than 29 known military bases across the African continent, and why growing African unity is threatening decades of strategic influence. It is about the economic challenges inside South Africa, the unemployment, the energy crisis, the inequality, and how, despite these struggles, the nation still holds the continent's most advanced industry. It is about Burkina Faso, once dismissed as one of the poorest countries on earth, now rising under Traoré with military, economic, and cultural confidence, building sovereignty where foreign influence once dominated, and inspiring millions of Africans who have spent decades watching their nations exploited, divided, and micromanaged by global powers. This is a story of how two countries, facing different struggles, found common purpose, why their alliance is igniting hope across Africa, why young Africans are calling it Pan-Africanism 2.0, and why Donald Trump's criticism may have triggered exactly the opposite of what he intended. Because the refusal to attend the G20 ceremony was not an accident. It was a message that says Africa is done being lectured, done being pressured, done being told who is qualified and who is not. A message that is resonating from Dakar to Nairobi, from Accra to Addis Ababa. A message that threatens the old world order. And if this is truly the beginning of a united African geopolitical front, then what happens next is not just political drama. It is the start of a historic shift. The start of Africa stepping onto the global stage on its own terms. Today, we dive deep into how this happened, why South Africa took this risk, how Traoré became the symbol of African resistance, what economic realities are pushing African nations toward unity, and whether this unexpected partnership is sparking a continental awakening or the beginning of a geopolitical storm. This is not just a story about politics. It is a story about identity, about dignity, about a continent refusing to bow. And today, you will understand exactly why Africa is changing forever. As the dust settled after South Africa's refusal to attend the G20 handover in the United States, the world expected Pretoria to soften its stance. For decades, global power structures were used in nations eventually bending under pressure, especially nations from the global south. But this time, something different was happening. Instead of retreating, South Africa grew firmer, more confident, and more united in its message. Respect must be mutual, diplomacy must be equal, and Africa must no longer be treated as a spectator in the global arena. International observers were stunned at the calm yet resolute tone coming out of Pretoria when Trump publicly criticized South Africa, telling the press that the country lacked qualification to preside over a G20 symbolic ceremony. Many expected outrages. Instead, South Africa responded with an almost unerringly composed statement, reaffirming its commitment to fairness, sovereignty, and dignity. In the eyes of many Africans, this moment marked the beginning of something powerful, a return to self-worth long suppressed by foreign influence. And as these events unfolded, one figure on the African continent watched attentively: Ibrahim Traoré, the leader of Burkina Faso, whose rise had already shaken old geopolitical expectations. Traoré had become a symbol of African assertion, a reminder that leadership does not require permission from outside powers. His country, small in economic size compared to South Africa, had nonetheless become one of the loudest voices advocating for an Africa free from foreign domination. Traoré's support for South Africa came swiftly, not with theatrics or empty praise, but with a message that resonated deeply with the African public. He called South Africa's decision a sign of maturity, sovereignty, and African pride. His words spread across social media like wildfire. Millions of people from Dakar to Dar es Salaam, from Kinshasa to Nairobi, posted messages celebrating what they saw as a new alignment between two of Africa's most influential nations. The sentiment was unmistakable. Africa was tired of being dictated to. Economists quickly caught on to the significance of this alignment. South Africa, one of the continent's largest economies, and Burkina Faso, the heart of a rapidly rising Pan-African movement, represented two ends of Africa's political spectrum, one more institutional and structured, the other more revolutionary and people-driven. And yet, both were now moving in the same direction. The possibility of collaboration between them sparked discussions about a future where African nations stand together, not as isolated states, but as a unified bloc that could finally leverage its immense resources, population, and trade potential. To understand the weight of this moment, one must first understand the internal realities both nations face. South Africa, despite having the continent's most industrialized economy, continues to battle unemployment, inequality, and the lingering wounds of its past. The economic divide between communities is vast, and political tensions often run high. Yet beneath these struggles lies a society rich with innovation, resilience, and cultural depth. South Africans know how to rebuild. They've done it before, and they continue to reinvent their identity in the face of every challenge. Burkina Faso stands on a different battlefield, one defined by security threats, economic pressure, and decades of exploitation from foreign powers. But the nation's greatest strength lies in its people, who have rallied behind Traoré's message of sovereignty and self-reliance. In a short span of time, Burkina Faso transformed from a country overshadowed by instability into a focal point of African political awakening. The Burkinabe people, young and defiant, have embraced a vision where their country is no longer a playground for powerful nations, but a sovereign state shaping its own destiny. Despite their differences, South Africa and Burkina Faso share a fundamental challenge: foreign influence deeply rooted in their institutions, resources, and security frameworks. Whether through military bases hidden under the guise of partnerships or financial systems structured to ensure dependency, Africa's autonomy has long been undermined. The United States, in particular, has maintained a web of military installations across the continent, more bases and operational sites than most Africans realize. These bases represent more than security. They signify long-term influence, long-term leverage. But something is shifting. When South Africa calmly refused a G20 trip, and when Burkina Faso publicly applauded them, the message echoed across the continent: respect is no longer optional. Young Africans reacted first. Social media platforms erupted with clips, memes, and celebratory posts. The youth and majority demographic of Africa showed overwhelming support for this bold new tone in diplomacy. They saw in Traoré in South Africa a reflection of their own hopes, a desire for dignity, a demand for fairness, and a hunger for independence. From university halls in Johannesburg to rural communities in Burkina Faso, conversations emerged about what African unity could look like in practice. What if African nations refused to side with global powers? What if African leaders negotiated as equals? What if Africa invested in itself? For the first time in years, Africans didn't just react to global politics, they shaped the narrative. The impact of this moment extended far beyond political symbolism. It began influencing diplomatic patterns across the continent. Other African countries, observing the rising wave of confidence, quietly began reassessing their alliances. Nations that once operated in isolation started exploring the possibility of closer integration economically, politically, and even militarily. The idea of African unity, often spoken about but rarely pursued with real conviction, suddenly felt attainable. And as conversations grew louder, one truth crystallized. Unity is Africa's greatest weapon. Fragmented, Africa is vulnerable, easy to manipulate, easy to pressure. But united, the continent becomes a force that even the world's strongest nations cannot ignore. South Africa's decision and Burkina Faso's backing were more than diplomatic gestures. They were the first signs of a continent ready to redefine its future. And as these two nations began moving toward deeper cooperation, a question started to rise, one that would determine the future of Africa. If South Africa and Burkina Faso stand together, who will join them next? The growing alignment between South Africa and Burkina Faso did not happen in a vacuum. It emerged from decades of frustration, years of denied dignity, and countless moments where Africa was treated as an afterthought in global decision-making. But what made this moment different was not the refusal itself. It was the manner in which the refusal was delivered and the ripple effect it created across the continent. When South Africa announced that it would not travel to the United States for the G20 handover ceremony, many diplomats assumed it was symbolic, a temporary disagreement that would quickly resolve. They underestimated how deeply South Africans felt the need for respect, especially after the United States had failed to attend Johannesburg summit, a move many on the continent saw as dismissive. The tension had been silently building long before Trump made his remarks. With one decision, Pretoria exposed a global imbalance that Africans had grown tired of accepting. But what followed was even more surprising. There was no hostility in South Africa's voice, no emotional outburst, no desperate plea for validation. Instead, the government's response was calm, measured, and grounded in principle. The world had not seen the African continent speak this way in a long time, with the confidence of a region that understands its worth, not through aggression, but through clarity. This was the moment Ibrahim Traoré stepped in with a voice that cut through the noise. For millions of young Africans, Traoré represented not just Burkina Faso, but the idea of a new Africa, assertive, fearless, and unwilling to be treated as inferior. His support for South Africa was not political choreography. It was an emotional alignment between two nations tired of a world that too often dictated their stories. He emphasized that South Africa's decision was an act of dignity. It wasn't about disrespecting global partners. It was about asserting that Africa deserves equal treatment. He spoke of a future where African nations negotiate terms, rather than simply accepting them. His words were simple but powerful, carried by a sincerity the youth could feel. And as he spoke, something began happening across Africa that no foreign power could stop. The people, the youth especially, started imagining what a united Africa might look like. In Johannesburg, students debated whether South Africa could lead a new African economic coalition. In Ouagadougou, young professionals discussed the possibility of a West-South alliance grounded in sovereignty and internal development. In Accra, Kampala, Lusaka, and Maputo, conversations about dependence, foreign influence, and autonomy became mainstream topics among everyday people. For the first time in a long time, Africans were not discussing what the world wanted from them, but what they wanted for themselves. It was in this climate that the idea of South Africa and Burkina Faso forming a strategic partnership became more than theoretical. Analysts began discussing it on radio shows, political scientists wrote papers on its geopolitical implications, and YouTube creators across the continent posted videos that went viral within hours. Even in diaspora communities from London to Atlanta, Africans felt a renewed sense of pride, as if the continent had finally stepped into a chapter long overdue. Yet, beneath the excitement, the internal realities of both countries remain complicated. South Africa's challenges run deep. The nation is rich in natural resources: platinum, gold, diamonds, chromium, coal, the kind of resources that global powers depend on. But the benefits have never been evenly shared. Generations of inequality have created a society where wealth gaps are staggering. Urban centers like Johannesburg and Cape Town showcase modern infrastructure and rising innovation hubs, while rural areas still struggle with poverty and limited economic opportunities. Unemployment, especially among young people, remains one of South Africa's greatest hurdles. That reality creates a fragile environment, one where political dissatisfaction can grow quickly. Yet despite these challenges, the South African spirit is a resilient force through decades of resistance, cultural pride, and a deep sense of national identity. Burkina Faso, meanwhile, has been fighting battles that many outside Africa fail to understand. For years, the country dealt with insecurity fueled by foreign interests and regional instability. Young Burkinabe citizens inherited a nation that had been pushed to its breaking point. But under Traoré's leadership, they began reclaiming control not just of their security, but of their confidence. The nation's economic situation remains difficult. Burkina Faso is not a wealthy state by global standards. Its industries are still developing, and many regions rely on agriculture that fluctuates with climate conditions. But what Burkina Faso lacks in economic infrastructure, it makes up for in determination and clarity of purpose. The people understand the cost of dependency and the importance of self-reliance more deeply than most. These two countries, one industrialized yet battling inequality, the other smaller but charged with revolutionary energy, realized they shared something important: a desire to break free from foreign influence. Africa's biggest weakness has always been its fragmentation. 54 nations, each with different colonial histories, different languages, different institutions, often pitted against each other by global powers who benefit from division. When nations negotiate alone, they are vulnerable. When they negotiate as a bloc, they become unshakable. The South Africa-Burkina Faso proximity marked a shift in that balance. It showed other African countries that sovereignty was not only possible, it was contagious. Soon, analysts began identifying other nations that might join such an alignment. Mali, already in strong cooperation with Burkina Faso, signaled openness to broader African-led partnerships. Niger, dealing with its own struggle against foreign military influence, quietly began aligning with sovereignty-driven policies. Even countries like Namibia, Tanzania, and Ethiopia started showing increased interest in cooperation models that prioritize internal development over external dependency. The question was no longer whether Africa could unite, but who would take the next step. As excitement grew, the United States found itself facing a new reality. For years, Washington maintained major military operations across Africa, with bases in strategically significant regions. These bases were often justified as security partnerships, but Africans increasingly saw them as symbols of long-term influence designed to secure geopolitical interests rather than local stability. The refusal by South Africa sent a message that such arrangements would no longer be accepted without accountability. African commentators began openly questioning the purpose of these bases. Why were they there? Who truly benefited? Why were so many African regions resource-rich yet economically poor? Why did insecurity increase in countries where foreign militaries operated rather than decrease? These were questions global powers were not prepared to answer. As more Africans awakened to these contradictions, a new continental consciousness emerged. A consciousness rooted not in hostility toward the world, but in maturity that questioned, challenged, and demanded fairness. Inside South Africa, leaders recognized that aligning with Burkina Faso and potentially with other sovereignty-driven nations could allow Africa to reshape global institutions from within. A united Africa could negotiate trade deals on equal footing, demand better representation, reclaim control over critical minerals, and influence global policies. Inside Burkina Faso, Traoré's growing influence across Africa became a point of pride. His appeal was not based on wealth or military strength, but on authenticity, the sense that he spoke not for himself, but for African youth who had long felt ignored by older political elites. It was in this atmosphere that one simple truth began to spread. If Africa stands together, the world must listen. This realization brought hope, but also brought tension. Global powers quietly expressed concern about rising African nationalism. Diplomats issued careful statements urging cooperation and stability, coded language that many Africans interpreted as discomfort. Analysts warned that Africa's push for sovereign might destabilize global markets, a phrase that revealed just how much the world depended on African resources remaining cheap and accessible. But Africans were no longer intimidated by such warnings. The younger generation, now exposed to social media, global debates, and Pan-African perspectives, saw through these narratives. They understood that Africa's poverty was not a natural condition, but political and economic design. As the months unfolded, the South Africa-Burkina Faso alignment became a symbol, not just politically, but culturally. Artists began producing songs and documentaries celebrating African unity. Filmmakers created clips showcasing the beauty of African landscapes without the framing of struggle. Writers penned essays envisioning a future where Africans travel across the continent without visas, trade freely, share technologies, and collaborate on energy and infrastructure. This cultural shift was perhaps the most important of all. Political decisions could be reversed. Economic policies could change. But once the people begin to believe in themselves, once they internalize a sense of dignity, no amount of pressure can break that. A continent that believes in itself cannot be controlled. And that belief was growing faster than anyone expected. It was becoming clear that South Africa's refusal to attend the G20 ceremony was not the end of a story. It was the beginning of a movement in which Burkina Faso played the role of amplifier, energizing a continent that had long been underestimated. And as both nations continued moving toward deeper cooperation, the world watched closely, wondering whether this would be a temporary display of resistance or the foundation of a new African era. The months following South Africa's refusal and Burkina Faso's unwavering support marked a shift that neither Washington nor Brussels had anticipated. Diplomatic circles grew restless as think tanks began publishing reports warning that Africa was moving too fast, too independently, and too confidently. But on the streets of Johannesburg, Pretoria, Cape Town, Ouagadougou, Bobo Dioulasso, Bamako, Niamey, and Harare, the mood was entirely different. It felt like a sunrise long delayed. For decades, African nations have been lectured about democracy, governance, transparency, and accountability by countries whose own histories were stained by conquest, plunder, and political manipulation. Africans were told they needed external guidance, foreign experts, and international financing to survive. Yet here were South Africa and Burkina Faso, two nations with completely different histories, cultures, and levels of industrial development, showing the entire world that Africa could stand its ground without raising a fist. And the continent recognized the moment. As social media filled with hashtags praising African sovereignty, the youth started to realize that unity was not a myth. It wasn't an idea reserved for Pan-African conferences or symbolic speeches. It was something that could actually be built through decisions like the one South Africa made, decisions that demand respect, not permission. Burkina Faso's role became even more symbolic as Traoré began advocating for a new kind of African cooperation, not one dictated by economics alone, but by dignity. He spoke openly about the failures of past generations, not to condemn them, but to understand what must be avoided in the future. African leaders, he argued, had to stop seeking validation from global powers and instead focus on legitimacy from their own people. That legitimacy comes from sovereignty, not subservience. For South Africa's part, the decision to stand firm against external pressure began reshaping its internal dynamics. Economists pointed out that the country's biggest weakness, inequality, could only be addressed if South Africa regained control over its economic destiny. Political analysts argued that rejecting symbolic acts of disrespect was a first step in rewriting its global relationships. The nation began to see itself not merely as a regional power, but as a continental anchor one whose decisions could shift the African narrative for generations. The idea of a South Africa-Burkina Faso alliance was no longer merely symbolic. Behind closed doors, policymakers explored cooperation in defense, resource management, diplomacy, and infrastructure. South African executives saw opportunities in Burkina Faso's emerging energy sector. Burkinabe engineers welcomed the idea of learning from South Africa's advanced industries, automotive manufacturing, steel production, mining, logistics, telecommunications, and renewable energy. A new blueprint was forming, one built on mutual benefit rather than extraction. But perhaps the most powerful force driving this alliance was cultural. Shared African identities, something colonial borders had tried to destroy, began resurfacing stronger than ever. Musicians collaborated across nations. Scholars launched cross-country research on governance and development. Youth-led tech organizations began linking entrepreneurs from Pretoria to Ouagadougou. The renewed cultural bond started to shape something larger than politics, a continental consciousness. As this wave spread, African governments not directly involved in the standoff started reconsidering their positions. Tanzania, Namibia, Uganda, and even Ghana began publicly advocating for more autonomy in global institutions. Mali and Niger reinforced their alignment with Burkina Faso, strengthening the image of a rising sovereignty bloc in West Africa. Ethiopia, already working on expanding its geopolitical influence, observed the unfolding shift with growing interest. The world could feel Africa reawakening. The United States responded with carefully worded statements, insisting that it respected Africa's decisions while subtly implying that the continent should not alienate partners. But many Africans had grown immune to such language. Years of watching international institutions dictate policies that harmed rather than helped their economies had hardened their perspectives. They could see clearly that fear was no longer a viable currency for global negotiations. Europe remained cautious as well, with significant trade, mining, and energy interests across the continent. European governments were wary of appearing disrespectful. Africa had become too economically valuable and politically unpredictable to risk pushing further. But behind closed doors, analysts warned that if Africa continued moving in this direction, global markets would have to adjust to a new reality, an Africa that does not allow itself to be exploited. Meanwhile, Russia, China, and the Gulf states watched with interest, realizing that Africa's new momentum created opportunities for alternative partnerships. Africa could choose from a position of strength, not desperation. For the first time in modern history, Africa had multiple options, and that alone shifted the global balance of power. Inside Africa, however, people understood the deeper truth. This moment was not about choosing new partners. It was about choosing themselves. By now, South Africa's refusal was being discussed in universities, town halls, radio shows, and youth gatherings across the continent. The outrage had transformed into introspection, and introspection into action. People began questioning not just foreign influence, but internal accountability. If African nations were to stand as equals on the world stage, they needed to be strong at home economically, politically, socially. And this is where the partnership between South Africa and Burkina Faso held its greatest potential. Each nation brought something the other lacked. South Africa brought industrial strength, economic resilience, strategic global influence, and a large diplomatic footprint. Burkina Faso brought ideological clarity, revolutionary energy, and a fearless youth movement uncorrupted by decades of political stagnation. Together, they represented two halves of a future Africa, one rooted in experience, the other in momentum. But unity does not come without obstacles. Inside South Africa, some political factions fear that aligning too closely with revolutionary bloc led by Burkina Faso could destabilize regional economic ties. Inside Burkina Faso, some critics worry that South Africa's complex political landscape might dilute their revolutionary authenticity. These concerns were real, yet for millions across Africa, they were merely proof that unity requires effort. It is not built by convenience, but by conviction. And as Africa watched these two nations navigate their alignment, something extraordinary happened. The conversation shifted from should Africa unite to what will united Africa look like? Would it mean a single currency, a shared defense system, a continental market, a common diplomatic strategy toward global powers, infrastructure that connects Cape Town to Casablanca and Dakar to Nairobi, youth exchanges, research partnerships, cultural collaboration? Open borders? These were no longer theoretical questions. They were questions Africans were finally ready to ask and answer. In the end, what South Africa did was not simply refuse a ceremony, and what Traoré did was not simply defend them. Their actions ignited a spark, one that illuminated Africa's strength, potential, dignity, and hunger for equality. As the story closed, one truth became undeniable. Africa's rise would not be granted by global powers. It would be claimed by Africans themselves through decisions rooted in courage, unity, and self-respect. And now, with South Africa and Burkina Faso walking forward together, the rest of the continent had a choice to make: follow the path of sovereignty or remain in the shadow of dependency. The youth already knew the answer. The streets knew the answer. The future itself knew the answer. Africa had begun a new chapter, one written not in the halls of foreign governments, but in the hearts of Africans from Cape Town to Ouagadougou. And the world, whether it liked it or not, would have to adjust. Because a continent awake cannot be controlled. A continent united cannot be ignored. And a continent dignified cannot be stopped.